Thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join me today. Hope that you find something within this video that's a benefit to you or to somebody that you know. Please like, subscribe, share this video. When I was growing up in school, we covered certain American heroes. Lately, I've been seeing those same American heroes have their statues removed. And while we think their statues are being placed within museums, some of them are actually being melted down in secret. Basically what's happening is these statues of men that we should look to live up to be better than are being torn down and removed as if they were some type of idolatry, oddly enough to be replaced by people who would at a time never be considered heroes or people to live up to. And we've had many of our memorials defaced lately, which I find to be a problem here in America. Saying in a time where our statues are being removed, our values are being told they're not as good as they could be. I think it's good for us to also at the same time have a fair and balanced opinion of some of these people who at one time were heroes and very popular heroes too. Today's particular one is a gentleman named Robert E. Lee. Born to a Revolutionary War hero, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee in Stratford Hall, Virginia, Robert E. Lee seemed destined for military greatness. Descendant of one of the first families in Virginia, thus the aristocracy, his extended family included a president, a chief justice of the United States, and signers of the Declaration of Independence. His father served as a cavalry leader during the Revolutionary War and earned recognition as one of the war's heroes, winning praise from George Washington himself. Despite financial hardship that caused his father to depart to the West Indies, young Robert secured an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he put his drive and serious mind to work. He placed second in his graduating class in 1829. With 4 spotless years in which he did not receive a single demerit, and wrapped up his studies with perfect scores in artillery, infantry, and cavalry. In 1831, Lee married Mary Ann Randolph Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. From her first marriage, prior to meeting George Washington, as we know, George Washington himself had no actual children. The great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, from her first marriage prior to meeting George Washington. Together they had 7 children, 3 sons, Custis, Rodney, and Rob, and 4 daughters, Mary, Annie, Agnes, and Mildred. With all of Lee's military pedigree, Lee would not step foot in a battlefield. Instead, he spent his time as an officer in the Corps of Engineers, supervising and inspecting the construction of the nation's coastal defenses. In 1846, Lee got his chance he'd been waiting for his whole military career, serving with the United States military. The war with Mexico saw Lee under the command of General Wilfred Scott. Lee distinguished himself as a brave battle commander and a brilliant tactician. In the aftermath of the U.S. victory over its neighbors, Lee was held up as a hero. Scott showered particular praise, saying that in the event the United States went to another war, the government should consider taking out a life insurance policy on the commander. Lee earned 3 brevets for gallantry and emerged from the conflict with the rank of colonel. From 1852 to 1855, Lee served as intendant of West Point, and was therefore responsible for educating many of the men who would later serve under him and those who would oppose him on the battlefield of the Civil War. Just take a moment to think about the part of why the war was so bloody. Just take a moment to think about that part of why the war was so, I did say it right, of why the war was so bloody. In 1855, Lee took a position with the cavalry as life away from the battlefield proved difficult for Lee to handle. He struggled with the mundane tasks associated with his work and his life. For a time, he returned to his wife's family plantation to manage the estate following the death of his father-in-law. The property had fallen under hard times, and for 2 long years he tried to take and make it profitable again. On the matter of Lee owning slaves, it seems that when Lee's mother died in 1831, he inherited 10. The last mention in 1835 of any of these was a woman named Nancy Ruffin and her 3 pledges. When Lee's father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, died in 1857, Robert found himself the executor of the state. Curtis owned 197 slaves on 3 plantations. His will stated that they would be freed after payment of litigation and debt and within 5 years. Lee, being the executor, became the manager of those enslaved people, but was not the owner. In regards to this matter, Lee wrote to his son how Custis had left him with an unpleasant legacy. Lee would often rent enslaved people out to other plantations or owners to avoid managing them. In 1859, Lee was called upon by the United States government to put down an insurrection led by John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Lee's command of the battle took only a single hour to end the revolt. His success put him on the short list of names to lead the Union Army should the nation ever go to war. Because of his reputation as one of the finest officers in the United States Army, Abraham Lincoln offered Lee the command of the Federal forces in April of 1861. Lee declined and tendered his resignation from the Army when the state of Virginia Lee declined and tendered his resignation from the Army when the state of Virginia seceded in April 17th of 1861, arguing that he could not fight against his own people. That same day, Lee accepted a commission from the Confederate Army of the rank of general. Lee's first military engagement of the Civil War occurred at Cheat Mountain, Virginia. Lee's first military engagement of the Civil War occurred at Cheat Mountain, Virginia, now West Virginia, on September 11, 1861. It was a Union victory, but the reputation of Lee withstood the tide of public criticism that followed. He served as senior military advisor to the Confederate president, the Democrat that he was, Jefferson Davis, until June 1st of 1862. Lee took command of the troops, renaming it to the Army of North Virginia during the Peninsula War, or the Peninsula Campaign. He succeeded in driving away the Union Army of the Potomac under the command of George B. McClellan away from the Confederate capital of Richmond during the 7 Days Battle, but was unable to destroy McClellan's army. Lee then overcame Union forces under John Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August. Within 3 months of his command, Lee had rescued the southern capital, defeated 2 different armies, while inflicting 30,000 Union casualties and clearing the entire state of Virginia of enemy troops. In September of 1862, he launched an invasion into Maryland, with the hope of not just shifting the war's focus away from Virginia, but also to the capture of the northern capital. Not all went well. Although his vaulted army of northern Virginia was exhausted, ill-fed, and clothed from a poor supply chain and constantly marching and fighting, another army comes to mind. Constantly marching and fighting. Another army comes to mind. Believing a victory on Union soil would convince Great Britain and France to form an alliance with the South, when a misplaced dispatch outlining the invasion plans was discovered by the Union commander, George McClellan, the element of surprise had been lost. The two armies faced off at the Battle of Antietam. McClellan and his 87,000-man army of the Potomac, back from the peninsula, and now infused with the previously shattered remnants of Pope's army, brought Lee's hopes to disaster, stopping him along the banks of Antietam Creek on September 17th of 1862. In the bloody single-day skirmish of the war, which left some 22,000 combatants dead. Yes, combatants, American soldiers. Lee showed tactical brilliance on the field by holding off repeated attacks by a determined Union army twice his size, fighting McClellan to a stalemate. Following the bloodiest one-day battle of the war, heavy casualties compelled Lee to withdraw under the cover of darkness into Virginia to recoup his losses and await the North's next move. In December of 1862, a new Union Army commander, George Ambrose Burnside, attempted to cross Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg and to march on to Richmond. Lee was awaiting and delivered the most one-sided victory of his command, laying waste to 12,000 Union troops. Burnside, like other generals before him, had been quickly relieved of command, and a new, confident General Joe Hooker was the next one to head up the Army of the Potomac. This time, Hooker surprised the Confederates with a well-conceived pincer attack, crossing at several points to fall on both Lee's flanks at Fredericksburg, on the Confederate right, and the Wilderness, a very dense wood on the left. Hooker confidently predicted that in the face of this squeezing attack, Lee would be compelled to either retreat or be destroyed in the pinch attack against overwhelming odds. Instead, the unperturbed rebel commander responded to Hooker's boldness in kind and outflanked the flanker. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, considered a military masterpiece, Lee divided his inferior army and took an enormous chance by sending half of it under his indomitable corps commander, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, to hit Hooker 7 miles to the west on his exposed flank amidst the impenetrable wilderness. The attack was a complete surprise and told up the Union Army's shattered flank. Hooker soon, like the preceding generals who attempted to outfox the fox, retreated. Though bloody, Lee suffered 25% casualties. His stunning victory at Chancellorsville prompted Lee to head north again. This time, Lee faced the Army of the Potomac, now being led by the competent and cool General George Meade. In July of 1863, as Confederate troops stumbled into a town looking for shoes, it would lead to a 3-day battle outside the town of Gettysburg. Lee assailed the Federal Army under Meade in what would become the most famous battle of the entire war. Accustomed to seeing the North run at the face of his aggressive troops, Lee attacked strong Union opposition on the high ground. This time, however, the Yankees did not budge. The Confederate war effort reached its high water mark on July 3, 1863, when Lee ordered the massive frontal assault against Meade's center. Spearheaded by Virginians under Major General George E. Pickett. The attack, known as Pickett's Charge, was a failure, and Lee recognized that the battle was lost. He ordered his troops to retreat. Lee was dealt his worst loss of the war, losing some 27,000 troops. Taking full responsibility for the defeat, he wrote to Jefferson Davis, the Democrat president, offering his resignation, which Davis refused to accept. After the simultaneous Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant assumed command of the Federal Army. Rather than making Richmond the aim of his campaign, Grant chose to focus the myriad of resources at his disposal on destroying Lee's army of Northern Virginia entirely. Instead of ending the war, possibly early, he decided to pursue Lee's army. In a relentless and bloody campaign, the Federal juggernaut bludgeoned the undersupplied rebel band. In spite of his ability to make Grant pay in blood for his aggressive tactics, Lee had been forced to yield the initiative to his adversary. He recognized that the end of the Confederacy was only a matter of time. By the summer of 1864, no hope of foreign intervention, and lacking any more offensive in the face of overwhelming army and industry of the North, Lee would fight with Ulysses S. Grant for the final and most formidable time. The two men would fight a series of brutal engagements across the Virginia countryside, from the Wilderness and Spotsylvania in May of 1864 to Cold Harbor, June of 1864. The final setting in Petersburg that would last 9 months. Although weakened, Lee saw that his situation was not so hopeless as it appeared. Lee effectively halted Grant's thrust forward towards Richmond. And now, the two armies were fought to a stalemate and involved in trench warfare, southeast of the capital of Richmond, at Petersburg. Lee has also managed to inflict over 50,000 casualties to the Northern enemies. By the fall of 1864, Union General Grant had managed to gain the upper hand, decimating much of Richmond, the Confederacy's capital, and Petersburg. Understanding that the war was political as well as military, General Lee realized that with the 1864 election approaching, the high casualty the war-weary North had suffered at his hands might be enough to vote out Lincoln and prompt a more pro-South Democrat administration, which might welcome a rebellious state back into the Union, or even let the South go its own way. But due to the actions of another Union commander, this political upheaval never came to pass. When Lincoln was handily reelected in November of 1864, President Davis named the Virginian General Lee General-in-Chief of all Confederate forces in February of 1865. The South was doomed. A tired and resplendent uniformed Robert E. Lee surrendered the remaining army of the Northern Virginia to the surrounding and the mud-splattered General Grant in April 2nd of 1865. The capture of Richmond and the destruction of most of Lee's army, which he finally surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Saved from being hung as a traitor by a forgiving Washington and Grant, Lee returned home on parole until April of 1865, and he eventually accepted a job as the president of Washington College in Virginia, now known as the Washington and Lee University. He remained in his position until his death on October 12th of 1870 in Lexington, Virginia, surrounded by family. In the time following the war, Robert E. Lee was known as the Gray Fox. He'd also been seen as a marbled man for his stoic and almost impenetrable personality. Lee came to be regarded by sympathizers as a heroic figure of the war, not just the North. Several monuments to the late general sprung up before the end of the 1800s, notably in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Dallas, Texas. Like I've said about anyone who has a statue made about them, they had to be some kind of an asshole. They are men to be admired, but they are men with flaws, like any other, for we are all sinners. For we are all sinners. And his flaws did show. Some would say his most damning was his tendency to be profligate with other men's lives. Historian James McPherson calculated that Lee suffered the highest casualties as a percentage of those under his command than any other commander of the war, North or South. Again, but let's keep in mind that Lee served longer than all of them, as well as in some of the heaviest of fighting. Lee's confidence in the almost superhuman capacity of his troops to overcome all odds prompted him to send them on more daring and heroic, some would say suicidal charges, Pickett's charge, of well-prepared Union positions at Maryville Hill in June of 1862 and again Gettysburg a year later. But also can be noted that the Union applied those same tactics. His men admired him. One of the men in his ranks declared, "I would charge hell itself for the old man." Do commanding a martial figure, did Lee cut? What the fuck was I writing? Okay, fine. Also, it was reported that when the Confederates were marching through a Pennsylvania town, a brave and loyal Union woman brazenly waving the American flag before them. But then Lee approached, and as he rode on Traveler, she dropped the flag, clasped her hands together, and said of Lee, "Oh, I wish he was ours." There is little doubt that Lee's tactics will be taught at military academies for as long as the institutes exist. While some sought to have the statues and other monuments of the Confederate leader removed, you can also call him a Democratic leader, or again, the Confederates were and are the Democratic Party. Anyways, Confederate leaders removed from public view. I, with others, view this as an attempt to erase our history. When we are told that they will place them in museums, and we find out that they're melted down in secret, only to be revealed afterwards, the fate of those, only to be revealed afterwards, the fate of this erasure of our history. Like ISIS and the Taliban, the statues, these heroes of American history, must not only be removed, they must be destroyed. In 2017, after the City Council of Charlottesville became the site of several protests and counter-protests, in August, numerous demonstrations clashed, resulting in 1 death and 19 injured. Relatively low compared to how they'd make you believe. In late October 2017, President Donald Trump's chief of staff, John Kelly, addressing the topic of a Virginia church's decision to remove a plaque that honored both Lee and Washington, Kelly called the Democratic general an honorable man and pointed to the lack of ability to compromise as the cause for the Civil War, an analysis that drew the ire of many Democrats. And again, I would say the same thing. We're getting to a point where there is no compromise, or we're told that things are bipartisan when they're not. The Democrats will continue to enforce their idea as they try to erase their particular history and the history that is associated with them, such as, again, the Confederate States are the Democrats. And when Reconstruction happened, that's part of the when the Republic first started to feel the rot. So with that, I'm going to say I hope that you found something within this beneficial, either you or somebody you know. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. I know it's one of my longer ones, but I do hope that you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your opinion either on Robert E. Lee or on the erasure of our history, or anything that you think I might have missed. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to watch me. I'm going to go ahead and end it with God bless you, and God bless America.